Hello, thank you for being with us. Today I have a special guest, Jill Johnson. I actually came across her name listening to a course for therapists on grief. And I absolutely loved everything she had to say. And she has so much knowledge, so much wisdom to share with us. So I decided to interview her. Thank you so much, Jill. Thank you for being with us.
I'm so glad you invited me. This was such a delight.
I would like to start, but before that, I have to say something. We hear from our peers. Sometimes I'm a grief counselor, and I have experience, and I enjoy doing grief work. And for some people, that sounds a little bit weird. And even for our colleagues, I remember when I was still in school, and someone approached me. It was my last semester. Oh, so what are you planning on doing? And so, oh, I love working with grief. And she just looked at me, and this is a
They
counselor,
back
right?
up.
I know they got the what really. And the best thing they always find to say is, oh, I'm so glad someone wants to do that. Right?
That's what I say to people who do couples.
Yeah. It's true. Same with me. I actually started doing family training. In first semester, it was all that took for me to say, no, I don't want to work with couples.
Not my
Not my
thing.
thing. But I have to say, Jill, that you do have such a vast and actually personal experience with grief. You have been widowed twice before
Mm-hmm.
the age of 50. So unfortunately, you have felt grief as well. So you've worked with hospices most of your life. I mean, you dealt with people who were dying. You have dealt with grief from loved ones who died. So you have so much to share with us. So again, thank you. And I would like to start with something, a topic that I know it's very passionate for you, and it's a topic of passion for me too, because we know what it can bring in terms of expectations of grief for our patients and for everyone, because it's so popular, which is the famous phases of grief, right?
Right?
I know. I always go there in my book. I start with as a please do not expect to go through these phases, because first of all, that's not what Kübler-Ross meant. She
Right.
didn't mean it for grief, for
She meant it
the
for
loss,
anticipatory grief.
anticipatory grief, for people who were dying. So it's very different, and it's also not linear. But anyway, I would like to start with that and to hear what you think of it and your view on that.
I love what Kübler-Ross did because working for hospice, I did meet with literally hundreds of people before their deaths, which is an amazing experience. And you're right, when you tell people I love doing grief and I love doing hospice, there are a few people who will walk right towards you and hug you and say, you're my people. And then there are other people who back up and want to get as far away as possible.
Oh, yeah, I know.
And then they hear that I'm married to a funeral director, then they get even weirder. So what I like about the stages or the phases of grief is it helps people understand what's happening before someone dies. What I don't tolerate at all about it is after a death. I have clients who come in and say, I'm doing it wrong. I haven't gotten to anger yet. I don't feel like I'm ever going to get angry. And everybody's telling me, this universal everybody who's doing this universal telling, that I'm not going to get through it, and I'm not going to get to be able to move on, and I don't want to move on. And it puts such a heavy burden on our grievers
Mm-hmm.
because they think they have to go through this whole process. And it's what they went through when the person they loved was dying, if they had time and if that was an expected death.
Mm-hmm.
If it was an unexpected death, or a lot of the folks with COVID now who die so suddenly, they don't have time for that. But there's no bargaining after someone's died. You can't bargain to get them back.
Doesn't even make sense, right? The
Right. They've been
bargaining
cremated. You
phase.
can't get them back. We're done with that part. Right.
Yeah, yeah.
And you have to have a sense of humor. So forgive me when I laugh, but that's what I do with my clients, because my folks, when they see me laughing, it gives them that sense of, oh, wow, I really can still smile.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, someone
That's
I
so
love tremendously
important.
has died, and I've got this hole where they were, and I don't know what to do with it, but it's okay to laugh still and to smile and to enjoy a sunny day. I can still have those moments where I miss them. But I don't like the stages because they put this false idea of I have to do X, Y, Z. I have to go through all of these pieces or I'm not doing it right and I can't be done yet.
Mm-hmm. Or
And it's
there's
this
something wrong with
universal
me.
knowledge that nobody really has,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah. And also the fact that you have to reach acceptance, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
that's the last stage.
Which isn't real.
Mm-mm.
We reach integration, or we reach, the way I phrase it with my folks and in my books, is we reorganize, and then we take that reorganization and that helps us put the person who died into an accurate memory in an accurate place, and we take that part of them with us into our new reorganized life. We don't come to closure. It doesn't, that's not real, because they're still there. You still talk to them. When I
Mm-hmm.
first meet someone who's grieving, that one of the things I say is, when was the last time you talked to them? And they always look at me stunned and say, what, wait a minute, you know I talk to them? Of
Yeah.
course you do. Right? I've got a whole bunch of people who've died in my life. I talk to them at various times.
Mm-hmm.
My dad is the one that I talk to when I'm car shopping, because I know that he would cuss a blue streak and scare off the car dealer and get me a better deal. Right? We talk to them. So
Uh-huh.
I think grief needs to be seen as a more active process.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something that you work on, you finish up, and then you take them with you. But you don't
Mm-hmm.
close, because they're still there.
Yeah, and also we're not saying that you won't experience those, what the popularized phases. You will. You may go through depression, you may go through denial, and that's okay. And but also it doesn't mean that once you're done, once you experience that, you're done with it. No, you may come back to that many, many, many times over, right?
Mm-hmm. You're going to have moments of sadness where you miss them for the rest of your life. I
Mm-hmm.
refer to that as sadness, or like grief attacks or grief waves, because you drive past some place you used to go all the time with that person. There might be a sad moment. I try not to have someone define that as ongoing grief, because otherwise it feels like you're Eeyore. Oh my
Mm-hmm.
gosh, I'm going to grieve forever. No, you're going to finish the grief process, and then you're going to take them with you, and then you will miss them occasionally, yes, and then you talk about them.
Mm-hmm.
But you also want to talk about them for forever and ever. The Message from Coco, the movie, is my favorite.
I love that movie.
Isn't that the best
Oh,
movie
it's
ever?
it's the I finished that movie. All I thought about was, wow, everyone should watch this because it does help you establish a new relationship with death.
Yes, it normalizes it, which is what we should. We
Mm-hmm.
used to do death at home, and we
Mm-hmm.
used to all be familiar with death, and it was part of everyday life. And then we built hospitals, and we made it sanitary, and we took away that having the person at home and saying goodbye and being the ones who prepare the body, and we
Mm-hmm.
lost all of that along the
Mm-hmm.
way.
Yeah. I'm so happy you touched on the fact that you talk to your patients and you say, when was the last time you talked to them? Because
Mm-hmm.
that's another expectation also. And not only expectations, but it's kind of demanded from society that you put it behind you, that they're dead, they're gone, as
Right.
if they never existed. And that again is a lot of pressure on those who are grieving.
And if you,
I don't know where I read this the first time, but
mm-hmm.
uh, I read something that always stuck to me, which is death ends life, but never relationships.
Right, right. You want to finish what's left over in the relationship that's holding you back, but you keep that person with you. Because if you love them enough to have them in your life, you certainly don't want to erase them. Here in the United States, the common view is it should take about 2 weeks after someone dies to be completely through it and back on the road. And that's mostly because other people are uncomfortable seeing someone grieve. So
Mm-hmm.
they want them to be done and they silence them.
Mm-hmm.
And if we could get that message out that that's not the way it really works.
Mm-hmm.
And we could also say, when someone's bringing up the name of the person who died, it's not because they instantly want you to be, super sympathy. They just want you to join them in remembering that person was part of this life and is still part of their life.
Mm-hmm.
Acknowledge their birthday, bring them up at Christmas, put the ornament on the tree, or put an extra menorah out for them. Whatever it is to bring them into your everyday, that's the Coco message. That's the keeping them with us.
Say their names, right?
Say their name.
Yeah.
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 It freaks out those who don't know about grief.
Yeah, which is most people,
Right.
Unfortunately.
Right.
Because that's what we hear from the day we're born, right? Death is something to be hidden, to be, closure. That's another word that I avoid, closure to grief. Also, when you talk about normalizing, the other thing that comes to mind for me is the emotions themselves, because we have this idea of having bad emotions and those we should avoid, and having the good emotions. So I have to embrace those, right? And that's my main goal in life, is to be in touch with these good emotions, quote unquote.
Happy,
so can
happy,
you talk
happy.
can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I actually use emojis when I'm writing children's books about grief and loss, because they identify with, it's the same thing we used to do as therapists before emojis were stolen from us. And because we used to have them on posters, right? The faces charts. That's where they got emojis. They belong to us first. I'm just going to say that out loud. But it gives having the ability to say it's okay to have all the emotions. You can be sad, you can be angry, you can be frustrated, you can be anxious, you can be scared. The number one emotion for people in grief is fear. And they aren't expecting fear, but fear comes up, and it could be all kinds of fears, but fear is there. Am I going to be able to handle this? Can I handle it financially? What happens if I'm a young parent when somebody dies? How am I going to take care of my other parent now that the one has died, especially if it was out of order? And God forbid mom dies first and leaves you with dad, right? There's all those kinds of things that happen. They're afraid. I like to get my clients thinking about all the range of emotions. And I also bring in the remembering who actually died and assigning real emotions to that, instead of this artificial, just because you're dead, you're not an angel. You're still a real person, and you still had all the things that were part of you. And maybe you still were the person who chewed with your mouth open. Whatever it is, I want my clients to be in touch with those emotions so they can have an accurate process of grief. And they should still be able to laugh and smile, but they shouldn't be forced into it.
Yeah, that's another good point, because we do tend to, when the person dies, everything that was bad or uncomfortable or undesirable about that person goes with them.
It disappears.
And it disappears. I mean, they're perfect. I mean, don't say anything bad about them. And I think it's very important that you remember those too, because that's part of who they were, right?
Right. Because you can't, how do you grieve someone if you're not talking about who they were? How do you deal with what things that they should have probably apologized for? If you're still holding on to those and you're still trying to move forward, it's hard to put those two together. We all have things we should have said. We all have things we should have apologized for over the course of our lives. Not a one of us is absolutely a pure heart. And I'll be the first one to admit it. I want my children to talk at my funeral about what I turned into when I came home and there were dishes in the sink. Because that was a bad mom moment every time, and it still is. And they're adults. Right? Don't leave my kitchen a mess. Right? And that's normal and human. Right? I'm still a loving mom, but I have those moments.
Yeah, but that's the whole of who she was, right?
Right. I'm also the crazy one who collects dogs, and they know that too.
The other thing, talking about that, can you show your dog?
Oh, yeah, this is
for those who will be watching this on YouTube. There's a dog. Oh,
there's
so
Adele. We have several poodles, and they're all older, and they all go to work with us because they're really good for folks who are grieving.
Well, the other thing that when you were talking about, in order for them to be whole, they have to have this integrated memory of who they were before they died. I was thinking also for those who didn't have the relationship they wish they'd had. So that's another kind of grief too, and that's one of the hardest griefs to go through, because you have something that there will be no time to maybe get to where you wanted to be with that person.
To fix it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that if you have the ability to do hospice with a family, you sometimes do get to do that reparative work before someone dies, to
Mm-hmm.
bring that person back in and to fix whatever is there, or at least to address it so it's out in the open.
Mm-hmm.
That also
Mm-hmm.
tends to cause conflict for the rest of the family because they've all been there with this person who's sick. And all of a sudden, the person who's dying wants to see this, basically it's the prodigal son story all over again.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to bring in the bad one and fix
Mm-hmm.
things. It's necessary. It's part of
Mm-hmm.
finishing a relationship with someone.
Does it happen often with your experience in hospices that they want to fix relationships and mend them?
Always.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
What
Yeah.
did
If
you
there
hear
was
the most from them? I mean, when they were dying, was there something that you could pinpoint?
kids wanted to apologize for bad behavior as teenagers,
Hmm.
universally. And parents frequently wanted to apologize for not being the good enough parent, for not spending enough time. Sort of that same thing about nobody's ever glad that they've spent so many hours at work. There's a
Hmm.
lot of that piece.
Yeah.
Sometimes there's been abuse in the history, and the parent who wasn't as protective wants to apologize for that. Um, Not giving them all the things that they could, even though they couldn't, because
Mm-hmm.
everybody's limited in what their means are. But I really wish I could have XYZ for you. It's all the regrets and things that they want to repair. When there's substance abuse, that comes into play. And people frequently want to apologize for however they behaved, if they're now sober but they weren't before,
Mm-hmm.
what things they might have done and harm they might have caused.
Mm-hmm.
And kids, likewise, who've had substance abuse issues or other issues, want to come home and repair that with grandparents or parents or spouses. Spouses who were unfaithful will frequently want to have a final "I'm so sorry, I've always loved you" kind of a moment.
Mm-hmm.
It's the regrets, behavioral
Yeah.
regrets that people want to finish.
So, Jill, let's talk about when someone is grieving, and we know how hard it is in our society to talk about this, because as you said, we expect them to be sad and depressed and out of their normal selves for 2 weeks. And then after that, they're all this get over with, get rid of their stuff and move on and all of that. How can you kindly talk to someone who is pushing you to get over it? Because that's a hard one, especially when it's someone you love, a relationship that you want to keep.
I practice with my clients. We do a lot of role playing in my office, on setting boundaries, because that's one of the biggest parts of grief work, is setting boundaries from the very beginning, because otherwise it becomes everyone else's grief process imposed on the person who's the primary griever. And they need to be able to set out their own grief process, and they get to decide how fast, how slow. And when we practice those things, we practice ways that they can say things like, I'm the one who's had the loss. I really need you to let me do it my way. One of the things I joke about with my clients, but it gets the point across, is having a grief card, like the ace of spades, and you toss it down on the table, right? Here's my grief card. How dare you tell me I can't do this, or I have to do this now? I'm the one who's grieving. I'm the one who's had the loss. Much of the time when someone's pushing someone to get over a loss quickly, it's because they're uncomfortable with grief. So it's an adult child who wants, typically mom, to stop grieving so long. Let me get rid of dad's clothes. It's too hard for you to look at it. No, it's
Mm-hmm.
not. It's my choice. I find it comforting to have dad's clothes here. And I'm going to keep them as long as I please, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So we practice how to back people off and how to say, this is my process. And it's going to finish when I'm ready. And I'm going to come out on the other side as the person I choose to be. And if we can practice those kinds of statements, that will mean if they decide to really change things up, because grief can be a growth time. And if we can give them permission to be able to say, I'm going to grow through this and change, and my life's going to change, because this big, huge loss happened that I didn't ask for, I didn't want, I didn't ask for this new life, but I've got it. So now I'm going to use it to my advantage and do the things that probably I didn't get a chance to do before. Right? So we talk about how to set people back, how to say, it's not okay for you to push me. If someone is taking a really long time with grief process, they will sometimes come to me and say, I've been grieving for 4 years. I just need to be done with this. I'm tired of grieving. Then we look at what's holding them back. And if they've got a history of depression or anxiety, and does that need to be treated? Because grief isn't depression. But if there's already depression in the family, then certainly grief can aggravate it. And in that case, I refer them to a psychiatrist to do an assessment to see if a short course of medication might be helpful. I'm not a doctor. I can't tell them that, but I can recommend that they go talk to somebody about that.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because I have heard this a few times too. I mean, how can I know that it's been too long, or how do they know that it's just maybe it's affecting their functioning, or how can they know that, okay, this is I don't like to use the normal word, but this is grief and it's natural and it's individual, but it's been too long? I mean, is it because they come to you? Is that what brings them to you?
They come in and they say, this feels like it's gone on for so long, and I want to feel happy again, and I don't know how. That's frequently accompanied by, I did get to a point where I was starting to feel better, and somebody jumped me for it. Because when you are grieving, people like to impose their expectations. And so if they're coming to me and saying, it feels like it's been too long, or I've been to 7 grief groups, or I've seen 3 therapists, right? Then okay, there's something wrong. Do you want to stay grieving, or do you want to move into a new life? You tell me what you want, because then we'll get you there. And then they set where they want to go, what their goals are.
And sometimes it's affecting their relationships.
Oh, it's affecting everything.
Work, everything. Yeah.
When you're really actively grieving, you're not thinking clearly. Your thought process is wrong. You get tickets because you're not paying attention to red lights and stop signs. You get grouchy with people. You don't sleep well at night. You're up at 2 a.m. If someone is still up at 2 a.m. 3 years later, then we got a problem. Being up at 2 a.m. 6 months in, not such a big deal. But when we're heading past a year of that, then there's a problem, because now their brain's resetting into living in the trauma that was the grief, instead of seeing grief as a normal process to move through.
Okay, let's look at the other side of the coin. Those who two weeks later, they're fine, everything's great, nothing happened, because that's very dangerous too, right?
That fast is too dangerous. But some interesting research from the Johns Hopkins University a few years ago about cancer families in particular is that if an intimate partner has been dying over a long period, and the other person who's going to be surviving them has been grieving with them in that anticipatory process all through the illness, they're already reorganizing in their head before the death. Yeah. They are saying goodbye, but they're thinking about what it's going to be like. They're thinking about, little things, painting the living room, or big things. How am I going to make it through financially? But they're reorganizing in their head already. They're usually done with the majority of their grief in 3 months.
That makes sense, because they had time. They had time to prepare.
Right. They said goodbye. They finished all the stuff. They didn't have any leftovers. The problem with that is the rest of the family isn't the intimate partner, and they haven't been living with this. So they're still at the beginning of their grief process, where the person who's primary is done and ready to go and have their life and maybe date or do some other things. And it causes a culture war in the family system. If somebody, though, comes in and says, oh yeah, it's been 2 weeks, I'm good, then I start poking around with, tell me about your relationship with them. Tell me about what it was like to sit there the day they died. If I can get them in touch with those emotions, then we can usually back up that feeling that I'm done and walk through the pieces that were traumatic and re-educate about the dying process. And then we start the actual grief work.
But what if they didn't have time? Let's say an accident.
And
they're still going too fast.
That's going way too fast. With an accident, usually that means they're still in shock.
Mm-hmm.
And they're probably that person in their family that when someone dies takes care of business. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Most families have a natural social worker who just takes care of all the stuff. And there's another one who's hyper emotional. There's another one who's sort of rationally emotional. That taking care of business one is not going to come out of shock within 2 weeks. So they're still thinking they are just fine. They need a little more time to adapt. And that's where, with the shock piece, I go back through, tell me about that dying process. If it's an accident, how did you feel when they came to the door? What was it like when you wanted to go to the accident scene? What was it like at the hospital having to tell them to stop? Whatever that situation was, I walk them through that, and that will get them into touch with what they were really feeling in that moment before they went numb and took care of business.
Mm.
Right?
You're talking, and I'm actually thinking, going back to my past, and I'm that person. I'm the person who takes care of business. And I remember my sisters only told me this a few years later when my brother died. He was 26.
Mm-hmm.
And I flew into my hometown and I was there. I was extremely worried about my father and my mom. And I remember during the funeral, I had brought medication with me for my dad just in case. So I had thought of everything. And I was, the stoic one who called because it was an accident that had media attention. I was the one who talked to the reporters and all of that. And I was in the front line, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I remember at one point I looked at my father and said, this is too much for him. And I went to him and said, go home now. Here, I actually gave him the medication. And I said, go home. We'll take care of everything. And he went home. And I went home. I called all his friends. I was the one in charge.
You took care of everything.
Took care of everything. And my sisters told me later that they were so worried about me, that they would look at me and say, when is she going to break? When is she going to break? And it only happened when I got home. When I got back home into my house and I was by myself. That's when I started my grieving. Yeah.
And lots of times it's that first time where you think, oh, I'm going to call my brother and tell him about this. Oh, wait, I can't. It's those kinds of moments that get people into touch with that. But accidents are really hard to grieve. And especially accidents where you can't even see the body. Those are really hard for folks.
Yes. This is something I also want to talk to you. But I have another question. Let's talk about suicide and suicide grief, because we know that there are some differences. We have to deal with the stigma. And if people are not okay with talking about death, if it's suicide, then forget about it.
They won't even mention that person's name again.
Silence. It's what we find. So what is your experience with suicide grief?
Suicide, as a death by suicide, and I want to make sure we use the proper language. I know you're very aware of it too.
Yes.
When you're talking to someone about a person who has died as a result of suicide, first of all, don't ever say things like, oh, they suicided or they were a suicide. No, their death was caused by a suicide. It's let's get the blame out of it, because it adds to that stigma.
Yes.
Families who lose someone to a death from suicide are very stigmatized. They feel very alone. They will frequently find that their faith tradition is not as supportive of them as if it was cancer, because cancer deaths get sympathy and deaths by suicide do not. And so we really find that those folks do better if they have a combined support system of a group that's run just for families who've experienced suicide by someone who's a peer. So they've also had a loss by suicide, but they've been trained to run the group. It's a specific kind of group. Those are the ones who, in conjunction with individual therapy, do the very best, because they're surrounded by people who've had the same kind of loss, regardless of what the method was. And so they can connect on that very basic level of, we've all had this loss whose name can't be said. And we're all the ones that people are staring at us thinking that we're going to be next. because there is that feeling like if there's been a death by suicide, everyone else is at huge risk. And there is some of that, but if you do things right, then you can minimize that risk. The one thing that I find that my families who've had a death by suicide have benefited from, in addition to being able to talk about the nuts and bolts of how they died and the regrets they had for feeling like they should have stopped it, which is not something I've never seen someone who actually could have prevented that death. There's not a way to do that. We don't know what's in someone's head.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's that blame piece. But they also do really well if they get to go to one of the suicide walks. We have a lot of them here. I don't know how many you have there, but they're places where the families get together and they make T-shirts with their loved one's name on it and picture on it. And whole families get together and walk together. And then there's usually some sort of remembrance ceremony at the end. But they're surrounded by hundreds or thousands of people who share that loss. And it's that strength of being together with other people who can also say the same things without shame that really makes the difference.
Jill, how do you help families who are stuck on why? And they spend years and years and years trying to, why did they do it? Even when they say, well, I see that they were having this problem or that problem, but still they go over and over and over the why.
We go through the what really happened, how long were the issues that that person had, how much did you do, because frequently the ones who are asking why are also the ones who did the most to try and intervene. And then we go through a permission giving process of there are things we just can't be in control of. There are things we can't stop. But let's look at how much they knew that you were trying to help and how much they knew that you loved them and how this is not a death where they were choosing to abandon you or leave you. It wasn't that. They weren't blaming you. They didn't do this to take something out on you. This was just something that in their own head they couldn't see a way out of. And they knew you tried and they just couldn't find a way to make it not happen. Mm-hmm. We do a lot of permission giving and a lot of forgiving, self-forgiving. Sometimes we bring in the whole family to talk about all the ways everybody else had tried, because frequently they haven't shared that. Oh, I didn't know you did that. Oh, I didn't know you did that either. So
getting the family together is important.
Getting the whole family together. Look how many ways we tried to stop this. And there was something in that person that just didn't think that tomorrow was ever going to be good or that the pain was ever going to stop. And we were powerless to stop that from happening.
Mm-hmm. Another topic I would like to ask you about is, we touched this in the beginning of the interview, because with suicide, it's more prominent, which is people being rude and saying horrible things to you. Oh, how come you didn't see that, especially when you're a parent? Mm-hmm. It does happen, unfortunately. I hear this every person I interview and I talk to, and I've talked to hundreds of people over these last 12 years. And if they come from a religious place, that, oh, it's a big sin, and we know how religion sees suicide, and so many of them lose their religious or faith communities because of that, because they don't feel that they are being understood. So how do you deal with that?
With the blame part of a loss by suicide, I really have, we talk about in every loss, we also lose other people. There are secondary losses. Mm-hmm. And sometimes those people who were saying those things, for whatever reason, they thought that they were being helpful by saying those things. Those are the people that don't necessarily have to stay in our inner circle anymore. We can move them out and still keep them around, but we can move in the people who are now our biggest support system. Mm-hmm. I literally draw concentric circles and we move people in and out. Or we do Venn diagrams and, you know, who fits where and where's the overlap. Mm-hmm. Who goes to the outside now? And we look at why are they feeling like they need to have a way to blame you. Is that because they're trying to remove their own guilt? Is there some part of them that they need to find a way to get out of thinking about this, so they're going to put it out on you? In terms of the religious piece, I have yet to meet someone who's grieving who didn't question their faith, no matter
Yeah.
how someone died. And then people say things that add to that. I have like a 5-page list of things people say to people who've had a loss. And 3/4 of them are religious. And they're meant to be helpful for some reason. But when you hear God needed another angel, if you're the griever, your first response is, then he can have your angel. I want mine back.
Yeah.
I didn't give permission for this, right? Or there's a bigger plan for this. God had a plan for this death. Okay, well, that means God is personally reaching down and grabbing people and making them die. And that doesn't feel like a loving God to most people, right? So we talk about why it is that people are thinking they need to fill silence by saying things that turn out to be hurtful. They just don't know how to let there be silence around holding space. And I also let my clients feel angry. If they need to be pissed off at God or whatever their belief system is, that's okay. If they need to leave that behind and find a new faith tradition or move into not having one, I support them in that. I don't join in with their anger because it may be temporary and they may want to return to that belief system. And I don't want to alienate them by making them feel like, ooh, Jill thinks I'm not okay with it. And now I am okay with it again, right?
Yeah.
But I've seen a lot of faith leaders say stupid things too. And they don't mean to, but they do. I've had a minister say, oh, well, I understand the reason that you used morphine was because you wanted the death to be faster. No, we used morphine because it was for pain control.
Yeah, so
right?
they wouldn't suffer, right?
So they wouldn't suffer. There are lots of chaplains who know exactly how to handle death and dying, but they're the only ones who are specifically trained in terms of ministerial types to be able to talk about death and dying comfortably and with ease. Folks who are just faith leaders in their communities, they're not trained in that, and they don't know what to say, and they can cause a lot of hurt.
You were talking about the secondary losses, and it came to mind what Thomas Joyner says: when you lose someone by suicide, you change your address book. And it's
and
so
you empty
true.
out your cell phone.
Yeah,
and you add all the new people in. Yeah, because loss by suicide causes a tremendous change in who's in your life. I know lots of people who've changed jobs and careers because they don't want to be around the people who said whatever they said after the loss. They just need to really change all of their geography and all of their people.
For those who are listening, Jill, can you give some examples of things that would be good to hear in a moment like that, or helpful?
One of the things that I say is, I'm just here with you. Let me just sit with you. When someone has had a loss, a tremendous loss, they don't need words. They need someone there holding space. They might want to hear something like, I have no idea what you're going through, but I just want you to know that I love you and I'm here with you and I'll do or be whatever you need. I am certain that person did not intend to cause you any harm because they loved you. I am certain that that was not intentional to leave you behind. I am certain that they were not blaming you. You didn't cause this, but let me just sit with you. Let me just sit and hold space with you. It's the best thing that a friend can do. It's the best thing that someone in a ministry standpoint can do. And it's the best thing a therapist can do. Just hold that space and hold them and let them just experience it and know that they've got support, absolute unconditional support, and no blame.
Yeah, those are great suggestions. Thank you for that. Well, before we end, I cannot end this interview without talking about COVID and about what we're going through right now. This is a different type of grief because it's so unexpected. We're not having time to say goodbye, to see the bodies, to say goodbye, to join our communities and do that together. Such a hard time we're going through right now, Joe, isn't it?
It absolutely is. It's horrific. And in fact, my wife is currently deployed in New York City because she's with
Mm-hmm.
the National Disaster Mortuary Team. So she's literally, as we're
Wow.
talking, working in one of the large morgues in New York. And there are hundreds of people every day who lose someone in a hospital that they didn't get to say goodbye to, and then their loved one is removed from the hospital and taken to a morgue, and for days they may not know where their loved one is actually gone until they're
Mm-hmm.
tracked down to be able to take to a mortuary. COVID has made losses so much bigger, and even non-COVID losses, because if you've had a loss and that person has died in the hospital but not from COVID, the same thing stands. You can't go in,
Wow.
you can't be with them, you can't say goodbye. If they're having surgery that's dangerous, you can't be there waiting for them to come out, because the hospital is, very rightly so, trying to protect everybody. But it's
Mm-hmm.
causing families to not know what's happening. What I've talked to nurses and medical staff across the country, and in fact in other countries as well, is they're trying their best. They have cell phones, they have tablets, they're trying to give goodbye moments.
Mm-hmm.
But when someone goes into that respiratory syndrome, it's very fast.
Yeah.
There is no time, and they're intubated. And when you're intubated, you are sedated, and then they're gone. And so there's really no goodbye time. And
Mm-hmm.
that's leaving families with all the thoughts in their head about what probably happened. And that's causing even more trauma for them,
Mm-hmm.
because all they have is their imagination and all the stuff on the news and all the stuff on social media, all of which
All
is
the anxiety, all the,
scary.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the images are terrible. And their loved one may have had a peaceful passing, but all they've got is all the other stuff
Mm-hmm.
and all the commentary. And then at the same time, they're also hearing everywhere the chatter about, this is not that dangerous. It's not that big a deal. It's just like the flu, except it's not, because their loved one is the one who's dying.
Yeah.
And so we have a lot of work to do, because we're going to have so many traumas from that. People are being notified from, across a lawn that someone's died, because you can't even walk up
Oh
and hug them
God.
and tell them that their loved one has died. You have to say it from 6 to 8 feet back.
Mm-hmm.
And then sometimes that loved one has also been infected. And so they're having to be in quarantine for 14 days. And over here right now, we can't have funeral services with more than 10 people. So, and at funeral, you can't hug somebody. So all of the traditions of saying goodbye,
Mm-hmm.
the
Gone.
caring for the body, the saying goodbye, the being able to approach the casket, the having time to plan things, all of that's been removed by this virus that 3 months ago none of us had even heard of or paid attention to.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a lot going on with that, and there's a lot of extra grief that's going to take place because folks aren't going to be able to say goodbye.
Mm-hmm.
And then we also have people who are, they're minimizing the loss. Okay, but my loved one died 2 months ago, and we didn't have a funeral because we weren't allowed to, but your loved one just died, so we should have your funeral first. And maybe I just won't have one because it's been so long.
Mm.
It's very much like occurred after 9/11 here. There were funerals day after day after day after day. And the important thing about COVID is for all of us to remember that if you know someone who's having that service now, or even debating having a service, support them in having it and then attend. We're going
Mm-hmm.
to have a lot of services to go to. There are a
Yes.
lot of
Yeah.
funerals of various kinds that are going to be delayed, and we need to all show up, because every family needs to know that their loved one's loss counted just as much as everyone else's.
Mm-hmm. And the ritual is so important. So
That ritual is
if
how
you
you say
can do it
goodbye.
now, plan it to do. I actually listened to, there was a pastor, I can't remember his name, but I think it was a New York Times who put it together, but he actually had a service online, with all these apps that we have now, Zoom and Skype and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And it was so beautiful because he said, no, I can't just let go like that. My wife died. She
Mm-hmm.
has friends. So he actually put it together online. So until I have something proper, this is what I'm going to do for her memory.
And I love that we're doing that, but I really hope that those folks who do that will then have a
Yeah.
secondary service
Yes.
so they
Mm-hmm.
can be with those people.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's something just so wrong about having a service and not being able to hug somebody.
I know. It's
Right?
just,
We should be able to do that. And so we have drive-in theaters doing services now,
mm-hmm,
but it's still not
mm-hmm,
the same. So I think we need
yeah.
to, as therapists and as community members, really step up and say, look, if you're hesitating, let me help you. I'll help you plan it if you need to, but your loved one deserved that, and you deserve to see how many people that loved one touched in their life,
Mm-hmm.
because that's their legacy, and that's what you take with you into your new life, that all those people cared. And that's important.
Yeah. Well, Jill, I thank you so much for this interview, but I would like to end this on a lighter note. So you
Oh,
say
yes.
you are married. I know, because you talk about humor and how important it is. We're talking about serious stuff, but let's bring some other emotions that are part of life too into this. So
Yeah.
you are married to a funeral director, is that it?
Oh, yes. So let me tell you my story because it will make you laugh.
No, but I have to ask you
Yeah.
something. So a friend of mine told me last week about this TV series that we didn't have in Brazil. So I just started watching it, the 6 feet under.
6 feet under.
So yeah, when you told me about it, I mean, it's a great series. And it's like,
Yes.
wow, maybe I have to ask her if this is anything related to what reality looks like.
It somewhat is, yes.
It
But now the
is.
thing is, when you're watching one of those shows with an actual mortician funeral director,
Uh-huh.
then they, of course, spend the whole time critiquing what's being done
Of
wrong.
course, yeah. It's like
Right?
ER, watching
Right.
ER with a doctor, right?
Right. Right. They have to fix it. And then when they're watching real funerals, it's really kind of fun to be on the back channels with them on social media. So, for instance, when Nancy Reagan was having her service and it was on all the live channels, and
Mm-hmm.
they brought her casket and they put it on the bier or the little stand that you put caskets on,
Mm-hmm.
and they got it wrong, and it was hanging over about this far too much toward the front,
Uh-huh.
so it wasn't balanced.
Oh my God.
Immediately, there were thousands of funeral directors chattering amongst themselves. Okay, who's going to lose their job for that one? Who did that, right? What's the chance that it's going to actually stay put?
Mm.
Somebody should stand up there and check it. And then there's another famous funeral, and someone didn't get the church truck out of the way properly, which is what caskets roll on, and it went flying. And so there's all those sorts of things. So that's the reality of life for the funeral director. You have a high awareness of everything that goes on, but we do spend our evenings in the prep room. That's date night is prep room. I hang out, and I'm officially on staff so that I can actually legally be there. And so I mop floors and wash hair. I don't do any of the other stuff because that has to be a licensed embalmer. Yeah, that is our world. My first wife and I were married 23 years, and adopted 3 kids, and started the poodle tradition. And then she died of pulmonary fibrosis after breast cancer and chemotherapy. And we had lots of time. We got to say goodbye. She had a peaceful passing. But while she was sick, she got to know the hospice nurse very well, and they became best friends and best buddies, and they liked all the same stuff. They had the same background. And so before Linda died, she started telling people, Casper has to come back and marry Jill because she can't raise the kids the rest of the way by herself. And
Did
we
it
both
happen?
said, you need to shut up. This is weird. We are not on Fantasy Island. And no, stop it. Shut up. Stop. She told everybody.
Oh
She
my
told the
God.
minister. She told the kids. She told my mom.
Oh my God.
And after she died, turns out she was right. Casper and I got along like gangbusters. And I was one of those people she'd been sick for 4 years.
I guess she knew
right?
you, huh?
She knew. So we ended up married. And then just about 6 months into our marriage, Casper ended up with Lewy body dementia.
Oh.
And which is what Robin Williams had, which is why he chose the death that he did, because it's a horrific disease.
Yeah.
And I fault him not at all for that.
No.
And so the funeral director that I met with Linda to plan her service and her cremation was also then became a friend with Casper. And then when Casper got sick, because when you remarry as a young widow, people get a little bit freaked out and a little judgy.
Yes.
And they tend to drop you like a hot potato because you're not grieving someone enough. And so Stacy kind of worked her way into the family and started taking the kids places. And she helped me a lot, along with several of the girlfriends, during the final stages of Lewy body, which is not a fun way to die. And then she made the plans for Casper. And then after Casper died, I married her. So I keep my wives close, and I meet my wives at the mortuary.
Oh my goodness. This is such a great story.
Isn't it a great story? Yes.
I know. It's
I am
wonderful.
when I say I'm okay with people dying and I'm, death
You
is part of
mean
life,
it.
I mean it.
You mean it.
Yes,
Oh
that's how
my-
I live.
Jill, thank you so much. And thank you for this brilliant ending to our interview.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
You stay safe, you and your dogs. How many? 4?
5.
5 dogs. And your
Yes.
wife.
Uh-huh.
And you stay alive because we need you, okay?
I'm planning to. Thank you.